maybe just shy of an instant classic, but either way, a phenomenal game. Penn State and Ohio State goes down to just shy of the wire. 33-24 Penn State. Some costly turnovers down the stretch by Sean Clifford result in points for Ohio State, and that is essentially the margin of defeat, 33-24. I'm your host, Thomas Frank Carr, here on the BWI Live Postgame Show. Make sure you like the video so that we can get more people here and we can talk for a while about Penn State football as they drop their third game in a month. I'm your host, Thomas Frank Carr. With me, Tom Hannifan. He is of the Paydirt Podcast. We are here breaking down Penn State and Ohio State. Tom, good evening. I know as our resident Penn State fan, this is not the most upset you've been, but another tough loss for Penn State football. How are you feeling right now? I just want to check in with you before we start, see how you're doing.
Yeah, I think the expectations were very low going into this game because of the performance, obviously, against Illinois and how terrible that loss was. And admittedly, coming into this game, I looked at some of the odds makers and like the spread of 19, the over-under of 61. There's just something in my gut, and I think a lot of Penn State fans, that it's like, that just doesn't feel like that's going to be the story of this game. And ironically, those were both correct if you bet the under, bet for Penn State to cover the spread, that is. So my biggest takeaway, T. Frank, is just I don't know what this team's identity is. Week in, week out.
Yeah.
I described it on my own podcast as Jekyll and Hyde. And the best examples thus far of that are this Ohio State game, the Illinois game, and then victories against Auburn and Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Is that you've seen the absolute basement with the Illinois game, and now you see it's like this is a team that at one point, like, we were like, yeah, this is the number 4 team in the country, and people were like, they could be in the playoff. This makes sense.
Yep.
Quality win at Wisconsin, quality win against Auburn, who just beat Ole Miss, by the way.
Yep.
I don't know what this team is, and I think that was kind of the reason that the game played out the way it did today, is because you could tell Ohio State underestimated Penn State based on what they did against Illinois, and you could tell they were visibly frustrated, the coaching staff and the players, that they're like, why is Penn State still in this game? So I just walk away more flabbergasted and confused than angry about the loss. In fact, they played Ohio State extraordinarily well for the most part, and then the turnovers are what killed you in the end.
Yeah, and a couple of those. This team is Sean Clifford. So this team's identity is Sean Clifford. Without any semblance of a running game, this team lives and dies on the arm of number 14. And tonight, for the majority of that game, it was 22 of 34 for 361 yards. Sorry, I was looking at CJ Stroud. Amazingly similar lines tonight, but no. 35 of 52, 361 yards and a touchdown. It was that even the fumble was one thing. But the last interception is what killed them, and it was with pressure because they had to throw the ball 52 times. And for all of you in the chat that have been banging on the door of, my castle here of the running game doesn't matter, we are at a point where the running game does matter. This is historically bad. This is beyond the pale when it comes to what you're expecting of your running game. I heard in the chat a couple weeks ago, I think, I forget who it was, but somebody said, I can't believe we, meaning Penn State, are becoming Mississippi State, being Mike Leach. And there's, at first, I kind of like, not really, but yeah. Like, this offensive line cannot run block. They did. This was their best day run blocking. This is one of their best days where they were able to create yardage, and the third down situation was good for Penn State. That's why they had so many plays. They had 394 yards in this game, and 33 of those were rushing between John Lovett and Noah Cain. Throw in another 9 for Kevon Lee. So they almost got to 50 yards total. It's always tough because I can look over and look at the number, but I'm trying to do the math of all the sacks being eliminated from the rushing yards, and I can't do that math. I guess 44 yards rushing is what they would have if that was not taken away. So 44 yards rushing on the night. And they still pushed Ohio State to the brink where they had a chance to win late before the last interception. I want to get to some of the questions in the chat. And of course, if you want to throw your questions in there, we'd love to hear them. And we'd love to get your thought on this game. David, one of our regulars, comes in and he says, feel like this game was a couple terrible calls and some drop some penalties away from being a big Penn State win. Do you feel that way, Tom?
I'm with people on the snap infraction thing, and then I was like, I don't think I've ever heard that, or maybe I have, but it's just such a rare penalty. Whipple was having a weird game.
A snap infraction is when you snap the ball, but you don't snap it. Like when you jar the ball or you half snap it. That's a snap infraction. What he did is he fully snapped the ball, and they blew the play dead. I mean, again, this is the state of refereeing in sport, in football, at least. Like there are not a lot of referees, and I thought tonight's crew was actually one of the better crews. Even I understand what they were doing with the letting Jesse Lucchetta run 75 yards for a touchdown, so they could talk about it, and they didn't have to blow the play dead and get in trouble for doing that. I at least understand where that came from. But yeah, it was just that's not a snap infraction.
Yeah, that was odd. The penalty on John Lovett for going out of bounds, you could make the argument that he was pushed, but he really, based on his intent, he ran. No, in my opinion, he ran out of bounds, and he was hardly touched as he was escorted out of bounds in a direction he was already going. So people, obviously, I understand the frustration there. I agree that this was. Yes, were there some calls that were tricky? Yeah, and those always seem to happen. Not just because it's Ohio State, but those just are part of the game. Yes, some costly drops that really bothered you, but guys like Jahan Dotson and Parker Washington really kept you in the game. DeAndre Lambert-Smith is starting to come into his own. I really liked the options that were put out there for the tight ends in this game. And yes, there were some drops by that position, but at the same time, the way Strange and Theo Johnson really got involved, and Tyler Warren, that's really encouraging. That's a part of the offense that I was very interested in. And I find it funny that you mentioned, is this team becoming Mike Leach, a Mike Leach style offense? That is exactly what I've been talking about on my own show, is that at what point do you just start playing to the strengths of your personnel and not saying this is what we are? And that's the mark of great coaches. That's the mark of great teams, when you understand what you have. Yeah. And when the play calling is 64% pass and 29 runs for just barely under 2 yards a carry, the writing's on the wall. What are we doing after a while with
it's
this?
Barely over one. And again, with the sack yardage in there, it's 1.1 yards per carry. One thing that I think was something that happened last week versus Illinois that didn't quite carry over into this game, except for the critically bad plays, was Sean Clifford held onto the ball. And I give him credit for being tough in the pocket, even though that was 50-50 in a game like tonight, where he had to step into some throws and he sidearmed those, and then sometimes he stepped right into it and he delivered a ball. And to me, when you say Jekyll and Hyde, that's what it is. If they put it on his arm, sometimes he's not going to step into the throw. Sometimes he is going to short arm it and try and get it out there, and that's when those bad plays happened. But the holding onto the ball in the pocket and taking some sacks on the fumble, I went back and looked at it a couple times. I have to look it up to make sure, but I'm fairly certain it was just man coverage, and he double clutched the ball against the blitz, and you can't do that. So that, to me, it's a pretty simple thing for me today watching this game. Ohio State did not disguise their coverage a lot. They don't do that even now in this new defense that isn't the single high NFL-style defense where they're playing press man coverage the entire time. They don't disguise a ton. They rotate their safeties up and down, but they don't do anything crazy like Indiana or Illinois did. And that was the kryptonite for Sean Clifford. They did it late in the game when there was no other option for Penn State, when they knew they were throwing the ball and they could do some things. And even then, Sean Clifford was able to move the ball at times, but it came down to they couldn't get any big explosive plays. They had to dink and dunk their way. They didn't get that big touchdown to push them over the top. But again, neither did Ohio State. It was an up and down game both ways.
I felt Ohio State's game plan offensively was flawed. And even though
Yep.
granted, they won the game, they left points on the field. This game could have been a 12-point margin and could have been in hand well earlier into the fourth quarter. It seemed like, and it was kind of something I touched on before, that this was a team that was playing out of emotion and reaction as opposed to game plan and calculation. And what I mean by that is we all saw the Illinois game. We all knew it's like, hey, listen, if they line up with Travion Henderson and run the ball down our throats, we are screwed. And you saw what Travion is capable of.
Yep.
But they came out early in the first quarter being like, it's the CJ Stroud show. And I was like, okay, I'm like, you do whatever you want. You're playing right into what Penn State's defense is okay with you doing.
Yep.
It just seemed like a flawed game plan, and that Ohio State came out with something that they wanted to prove, that they wanted to really just plaster Penn State. And that just that didn't feel like that type of victory for Ohio State. Like, credit to them, you win the ball game, but like just some odd choices from Ohio State.
And I wanna preface something I said a little bit ago. Sean Clifford, because I think somebody made a good point. James makes a good point here of when Clifford's healthy, he's actually pretty good. If Clifford has any sort of running game, like if what we started the show with, if he's supported by a running game whatsoever, this game could have gone very differently. But just the circumstances and the situation of the offensive line pieces that you have, I had been saying for a while they need to try some parts and pieces, and mix some things up a little bit. And one of the suggestions I said is, what happens if you put Bryce Effner at right tackle? And we found out what happened: a strip sack for a touchdown. So.
Yeah. You know what I found
wrong about some things here.
You know what I found laughable, and I'm curious what you think, is the last 2.5 minutes on that drive where it was like, okay, it ultimately ends up in a stout missed field goal. That was a knuckleball.
Yeah.
Is that the first play from scrimmage is a play action pass.
Now, I knew that was going to come up. I'll let you finish.
I thought it was laughable because I was like, who in their right mind on the Buckeyes defense is going to honor that? Give me a break.
So conceptually, and they didn't do it again, which is important, but the first play of a drive in a 2-minute situation, sometimes teams do run the ball first. They do run the ball to try and catch somebody off guard. Now, it was a fake out to a fake out in that sense. And I understand the kind of eye roll about that, but this isn't 4th and 9 against Ohio State in 2019, where Chase Young is bearing down and you're running the RPO footwork. Like, it's a little different than that, because it was the first play and they had run the ball to start almost every single drive. So there is a little bit of that baked in. But you're right. At that point, no one cares if you run the ball. We want you to run the ball. That's the idea that the defense is giving you. So sure, go ahead and run. And, it is at the fight that got them back into the game when they were down twice by 10 points is the same fight they were playing with at that point. But to me, it's like the game was over, like it was realistically for all of us, it was over because the probability of getting the touchdown and then getting the 2-point conversion, all that stuff, you've got to play out the string. But I guess to me, that particular drive, I kind of throw that out because what is it? You're down 9 at that point, and you've got to get that in 2 minutes, and you haven't been able to punch one in the majority of your drives. You got 2 or 3 touchdowns today. What was it?
I think you're right.
3.
Yeah, I'm blanking on them. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I come back to what James said there in the super chat. The red zone defense for Penn State is phenomenal. I mean, yeah, you gave up 33 points, but honestly, it sure didn't feel like that. I'm sure Ohio State probably doesn't feel like they hung 33 points. And how many yards of offense did they have? Like 490 something or whatever. Like, it just
Ohio State? They had 466 yards, 305 passing, 161 rushing. So they, even without the 68-yard touchdown, they would have gotten close to 100 yards rushing as well.
Yeah. So like those are fantastic numbers on paper. It just did not feel like this gigantic margin of victory by any means. But the red zone defense for Penn State was fantastic. It seemed like against Illinois, they were trying to figure out who's going to fill the void from PJ Mustipher, right?
Yep.
It seemed like this week that they had a better idea of how to fill that void. Derek Tangelo at least had a good half of football, 3 quarters. You could just tell he was running out of gas in the fourth quarter. You understand it. And the entire defensive line was absolutely gassed. But what I was encouraged to see is that if Penn State wasn't getting the offensive line backed up into the pocket or in behind the line of scrimmage, they were at least holding it and allowing second level guys that are the strength of the defense, linebackers like Jacobs, Smith, and Brooks, to make a ton of plays. Whereas against Illinois, they had to make those plays. They weren't being designed that way. So this was light years better. It just seemed like the fatigue of the game eventually caught up to them in the end.
I was super surprised and very impressed by the young defensive tackles for Penn State, because as bad as they were in the Illinois game, they were that good tonight. Keziah Izzard, Devon Elise both had, I thought, very good games. On the one long run by Travion Henderson, there's a little bit of Elise had a chance at him, but really it came down to Brandon Smith jumped out of his gap. Surprise. He thought he saw something. He broke to the outside, didn't stay in his gap, got reached, and then it was 68 yards for the races. So that, I don't even think that was really on them. And you're right. By the time, even in those last minute situations where they're trying to get a stop, they give up the third down conversion. But again, Ohio State had to really earn that. They had to go fake quarterback sneak, fake jet. There was either a fake jet motion or something else, a part of that, the late shift, and then they had to run to the outside because none of the holes were open. Whereas last week, it was plain and simple. Penn State couldn't stop the run because up front, those defensive tackles were not stopping anybody. And this is what I was saying this week is I thought that was going to be a weakness, but even Penn State's defense is built to play in this game. This was a game about space, and Penn State was hanging on tooth and nail in the secondary, but for the most part, they did a good job there. And that was, I thought, really the story of the game is you had to put a lot on Joey Porter Jr., and you had to put a lot on Jaquan Brisker and Jair Brown and Tariq Castro-Fields, and at least half of those players stepped up to the plate and made big plays. And they went toe-to-toe with those guys. And that's one thing I thought after watching Joey Porter Jr. last year, he was capable of. And he, the penalties aside, I think you're fine with those, right?
Yeah, he's physical, and he plays that way every single time. He's going to get handsy with guys. I think Tariq Castro-Fields is a little bit more conservative in that, but he likes to play tight. So you're happy with that. Daquan Hardy continues to be fantastic. To call him a backup corner is an insult. He's the third corner. He's the nickel corner. He could start anywhere in the country, it appears. So Penn State's very fortunate. And then the way Tig Brown played, about as physical as we've seen Jaquan Brisker play in his time at Penn State. So it's like, I'm not saying that Tig is exactly like Brisker, but gosh, they seem like carbon copies of each other at this point, which has got to make you feel fantastic. So they were really, really good most of the game. Yeah. Am I the only one that finds it weird that Chris Olave is an afterthought all of a sudden? Like, he was good in the game, but also just in the Ohio State offense. Like, it was Garrett Wilson City for the first half, and then Olave gets his touchdown, but for the most part, just kind of an afterthought.
So I think Olave, and this is where this is tough because their whole offense is the deep threat, but I think of the two, when you're coming into this game and you know that Penn State's going to play coverage, Olave, I think, is their deep guy, and then more of the possession guy, the route runner, the guy who's going to get those tough yards after the catch. That's Jackson Smith and Jigba, and that's Garrett Wilson. And then Olave gets the touchdown and has the big play, but that was kind of an afterthought because they weren't able to get any of those deep shots. Tariq Castro-Fields, man, I feel bad for him because he's in these situations and he's just this close, and then he misses the tackle. Smith and Jigba gets him a little bit on his heels on just a simple man concept.
That was ugly.
Yeah, and somebody tweeted at me and they said, "What is wrong with his tackling?" I'm like, "It's not the tackling; it's the coverage that put him in a position to miss the tackle." And then Jair Brown doesn't get that play and rally for the stop. And really, it's the story of big plays in this game. And James Franklin talks about this all the time: explosive plays and turnovers. And Penn State held their own in the explosive play category. If we look at the big plays here, Penn State had 240 yards passing on explosive plays. Do you know how many Ohio State had? And I'm asking you a question you don't have the answer to. So,
do tell.
184. So Penn State was the more explosive passing offense. There was 102 yards rushing on explosive plays, 21 for Penn State. And that's 10 or more yards on one individual run. And 68 of that came on one run for Ohio State. So pick your favorite big play in the game. That was the turning point. Was it the fumble and the fat man return, which always, I assume Penn State fans are not pleased that that's going to be on repeat for the next couple of weeks, right? Like you're going to have to see that everywhere.
They'll put that up there just because it's great that a big guy scored, and good for him. But that was tough to watch.
Do you think this is fair that Penn State just doesn't have the strength on the offensive line to play with Ohio State? I think that's pretty fair summation, right?
I would agree with that. That is a good defensive line. You've got some guys who are probably going to go in the first round, and like Haskell Garrett's really solid. They've just got depth all around. Their linebackers are outstanding. They were fortunate the targeting call got was it Chambers bounced? I think Chambers.
Yes, Steel Chambers, one of the greatest names in this game.
Right up there with Sauce Gardner from Cincinnati. It was obvious, and it's something I remember listening to a podcast by Brandon Noble, and he was talking about how the recruiting strategy for Penn State offensive linemen is looking for long-armed pass protectors. And he's like, that just inherently is not built to work against the run game, or work for the run game, excuse me. It hurts your leverage if you're getting gigantic guys with long arms. Okay, you're just not going to be the low man that wins. So it just seems like from its core, this offensive line is not set up to succeed in those games where it's trench warfare. And it's not that Ohio State's fielding, a Georgia-esque defensive line, but it's Ohio State. You respect the athletes they bring in. There's a lot that Penn State needs to correct in terms of recruiting strategy, it seems like, in terms of offensive linemen.
Well, that actually, if you don't mind a selfish
I know you love talking about offensive linemen. Yeah,
there's a lot of Phil Troutwine has been recruiting a different breed of offensive linemen to come to Penn State. They are all bigger, they are all meaner, and they are guys that I look at and I go, maybe I wouldn't recruit that guy. I think that's a good sign. Let me say this: I like the athletic pass blocking offensive lineman personally, like the agile guy that maybe you could hit it right and he becomes the complete player. These guys are on the other side of, we know they're really good run blockers. We know, like, what I'm trying to tell Penn State fans is help is coming, but it's going to be a little bit because they're all in high school currently. Or if they're JB Nelson in junior college, but
they're taking algebra right now.
Yes, they are. It's changing up front, and if you want to check out T. Frank's film room to see some of those guys that Penn State has commit in a class of 22 and 23, it's just going to take a little bit of time. But yeah, that's the reality. Is that it's not even the length; it's just that they're small. Like Juice Scruggs is 305. Mike Miranda lost weight to be 310 maybe at center, and Eric Wilson's 305. None of these guys are big physical offensive linemen on the interior. And then the tackles, they don't have any to play off of, and they're not playing well. So the offensive line, this is what they are. Like, there's not a whole lot of improvement that's going to happen. It's just going to be this, and then how somebody else responds to that. On the flip side, I thought Penn State, aside from the defensive tackles, the way they were lining up in the first half completely threw off Ohio State. That was a really good wrinkle by Brent Pry, because what teams have been doing to Penn State with the tight front with three guys inside the tackles, Penn State did that to Ohio State, which has a similar offense. So that shut down their running game in the first half and bought them some time to stay in the game.
No, I thought the defense, again, you knew coming into this game that Penn State's defense was going to be the reason that they hung around. And then, of course, Sean Clifford, what was he going to be able to do? The questions about Sean's health altogether. But defensively, James Franklin said it this week, and it was kind of a hollow victory that it's like, hey, we did give up 357 rushing yards to Illinois, but we only gave up 10 points in regulation. And it does make you think. It's like, okay, like, this is something they've consistently done this entire season. I talk about Jekyll and Hyde. That has been the one constant. So you're encouraged to see what the defense has done. Brent Pry continues to make adjustments, which is very encouraging. I want to bring up one point, and I know there's a great question in the super chat, and this is...
Let me throw it up here for you.
Yeah. At one point, I believe it was on when Lovett went out of bounds, and James Franklin was trying to make the argument that he was pushed.
Yeah.
Clearly, when you saw the replay, he was grazed, and he intentionally went out of bounds.
Yep.
James Franklin then is on TV saying to the referee, quote, "I want to challenge that." And then the referee says back to him, you cannot challenge that, because everybody and their brother who watches FBS football knows that you cannot challenge a penalty. So does anybody else find it alarming that the head coach of the Nittany Lions tried to challenge that penalty? On to the question.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not great.
I'll leave that there.
And yeah. Yeah. It's not great. I think for everyone that it's overblown how bad James Franklin is as a game day operator of the team. It's overblown. But there are legitimate criticisms. That's where I'm gonna land on that, because the idea that he is a great recruit, like, this is another one of those fallacies, one of those like canned responses that we always have. And I see these on our videos and in chats and all this stuff of like, we get this narrative and then we're just stuck on it of like, he's a great recruiter, but not a great coach. Well, yes and no, because if he's a great recruiter, why does their offensive line struggle so badly? Mm-hmm. And if he's a terrible game day coach, why do they win games? Like, why do they win games? I know we always point to the games that they lose, but why do they win games? They make good decisions. The fourth down decisions, whether you like them or not, and a lot of people don't, that is your opinion on those situations. But I do want to get to this, because that is a conversation to me that goes nowhere, because people have already decided whether or not they like James Franklin. Mm-hmm. This is a conversation that I was thinking about during the game for the bloggy friend of the show. Any issue with fair catching every kickoff, even the ones that you could presumably field, if you're a 3-touchdown dog, don't you want to take some shots? What do you think about trying to generate something out of special teams, which have been non-existent so far this season?
I'll start with the punting game, because I understand the kickoff game is what the question is about. On the punting side, you've got Jahan Dotson back there. Clearly, every team that Penn State has played is like, we are not going to let Jahan get space.
Yep.
I can't remember one time this year that he's really had a ton of room. I think his longest return was, maybe 16 yards or something like that against Villanova. And you had that feeling, and nobody gives him any breathing room. He's only got one kickoff or punt return for a touchdown in his career. So that's a struggle on the punt return side. On the kickoff side, I understand it. John Lovett is standing at the 5 or the 10-yard line, and he's waving for a fair catch. I think this comes back to something that James Franklin has been saying for years here at Penn State, is that he believes in the analytics of field position. And it comes back to something you touched on in terms of why is he going for it on 4th down when the ball is between the 40s? Well, it's because he believes that it's not necessarily a risk if you do go for it, because the loss of field position or the gain of field position is going to be negligible. I think he believes the exact same thing, that it's not worth it to field it inside the 10, because you could just fair catch it and get it 20 yards ahead of you potentially. Yeah. I think that's just the mentality, and he is an analytics-based guy. He's said that a number of times.
Yeah, and part of it too, and I don't know if this plays into it, but John Lovett is fielding that kick. You don't have any running backs, so like he's back there to fair catch the ball because you don't want somebody to drop it. I don't know that if they had a guy that they could use, like, I don't know, Devin Ford, who didn't suit up in this game, or if in the past they had a guy back there like Saquon Barkley that's a legitimate threat to actually break those plays. I don't know that they have a guy that's a legitimate threat to break those plays. So if it was a superstar, you had Miles Sanders back there when he was a freshman, or some really talented player, they just don't have that guy. John Lovett is not a game-breaking player. So it's kind of back to where, who was it? Gerald Hodges that was fielding punts just because he could fair catch it?
Yeah. Yeah,
I think that's where we are with that.
And you just don't want Jahan out there on kick returns, because you just don't want to get him hurt. There's less of a likelihood of that happening, I think, because they realize that they're going to make sure that he fair catches a punt, whereas a kickoff return, there's just so much more space and a lot more can happen, I think. Yeah. So you're trying to protect Jahan. I get that.
Plus, he's not a tackle breaker. Like, on a kick return, you need to be able to break a tackle. That's more of a running back body type than Jahan, who's a punt returner. He's a receiver.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Another chat here that I want to get in here, because I think that this is an interesting conversation about, is this good or bad? Because I think people decide that this is bad Penn State is much better against spread than it is power and I formation teams. Illinois and Wisconsin, as well as Auburn, are a mismatch. First off, do you agree with that? And is that an issue to you?
I mean, it again, I come back to, I don't know what this team's identity is with some of this stuff, because sometimes they play great and sometimes they don't. I think the secondary is why you feel good about the matchup against the spread more than anything. And then, yes, like the front seven, especially the front four, gets really taxed against the power run. So I guess I do agree with it. It's just not a rock solid agreement. The power run game, I found, again, I mentioned it earlier in this postgame show, is that I was just genuinely surprised to see how rare Ohio State bothered to go power, to go under center, and use the I backs or just use a single back, because they used it when they punched in the rushing touchdown. And I was like, that's all Illinois did. And you guys could have been doing this the whole game and having probably more success. So it might be that. I don't know.
And they have, I thought the broadcast did a great job of pointing out they have NFL-sized offensive linemen. When I was watching film earlier this week, I couldn't point to a weakness and find it. And I understand, like, the teams that they had played. They played Oregon without Kayvon Thibodeau, which makes that just another defensive line. Mm-hmm. And then they were playing teams in the Big Ten that you don't necessarily think of as like a challenge for an offensive line. And Penn State pushed them to their limit. That being said, all those guys are big, they're long, they're physical, they're fast. I was talking to Bill Rabinowitz, who covers Ohio State for the Columbus Dispatch, and he said they have 4 tackles out there. So they're big, they're strong, and they're athletic. I can't believe that they didn't run the ball more, too. They'd been running the ball a lot coming into this game. And part of it was to protect C.J. Stroud. And then in the game where you think you want to protect him the most against a team that's not going to give you the deep shots, not going to give you the easy cover 1 man and then bring 5. Penn State rarely did that in this game. You're going to not run the ball after what you saw the last 2 weeks. I was shocked. I know we're kind of repeating ourselves there, but like that blew me away. And then when they did, what was even more surprising is that Penn State was more than capable. And that's where I think where Larry here is right, is that Penn State, they have smaller, quicker defensive tackles. Now that PJ Musfer is no longer playing, they don't have anybody with size, so they work better in space. And Ohio State works in space, so they had a better matchup. That football is a lot about matchup, so it's right. I think that's fair to say. But does it matter that you should have beaten Illinois with a healthy quarterback? You should have beaten Iowa with a healthy quarterback. You don't lose those games unless something went very wrong and something went very wrong. And this game is more of an indication of what they are as a football team. Like, if they had won those last 2 games and lost this one this way, Penn State fans would be over the moon. But they lost their quarterback for 6 quarters, and now he's back. Yeah.
It does worry you, considering the way Michigan State went down today. Those are 2 heavy-hitting teams that like to run the ball. Talking about power, those 2 are still on the schedule. Walker might win the Heisman after the effort that he put together today, and looks like he's going to continue to do. So that's a challenge.
But do you feel better about the Penn State defense after today? And not just, and it can't just be entirely matchup driven, because those guys played well up front, especially with of the 2 teams, neither have a good quarterback. With McNamara or with Thorne. Thorne is very much the guy he's always been. Do you feel like Penn State matches up better than you would have thought after this game?
Yes. And I think, considering that you just played the number 1 offense in the country, and yes, they got their stats, they got their yards. CJ Stroud is still a redshirt freshman, and he, as much as he can be in the Heisman conversation, there's things with his accuracy. There's issues where he gets rattled a little bit, but he's still going to be an excellent quarterback. And he's the system guy that, the Urban Meyer system has been leaning on ever since Alex Smith at Utah, Tim Tebow and Chris Leak at Florida, and then so on and so forth. Name any Ohio State quarterback. It's the same carbon copy. So the defense really wasn't surprised by anything that they were getting out of the Buckeyes. And again, the red zone defense, how many times was it just like, wow, they forced another 4th down? So if you're able to do that and frustrate, as you mentioned, those quarterbacks from Michigan State, and also you've got Maryland to worry about, which beat you last year, and that is still a team you have to respect. Rutgers, you feel confident about, but still, like, this defense is going to be what's going to carry you. And then Sean Clifford, it goes with him. That's 1 and 2.
Yeah, and I don't think that there's there's really any way about that. The secondary, that's the problem, is that I still think that there is some tentative weakness up front with teams that want to exploit it. So it's going to be interesting down the stretch. Penn State, does this? I don't want to say this because, like, as somebody objectively looking at the game, of they played well, they just weren't good enough, but they have lost 3 straight. Like, how should you feel about this team at this point? Like, what? I know we keep going back and forth on this, and you say, like, I don't know what this team's identity is, but should you feel optimistic about their ability to compete in these games down the stretch and win 1 or 2 of them? Or
yes,
hopefully for Penn State fans, more than 1 or 2.
No, this was a confidence-inspiring loss, a moral victory, as they like to, or moral. Yeah, like that's about all you can really take away from this. It's not nearly as deflating as the Illinois game. Obviously, that was the bottom of the barrel. So this makes you feel like you can hang with people. It's just a question of, can you get it together? Can you organize the turnovers?
Is this fair?
On Clifford's health.
Is this fair? This comment from Phil. Franklin teams have been mundane. No big wins, simply cannot motivate or inspire. Of the things James Franklin does, like, maybe he doesn't motivate and inspire you, but I think based on the way his team played tonight, they were motivated and inspired. Like, I think that's a little off the mark.
It's an immeasurable thing for the two of us sitting in our homes, I think. And there's so many things that the Penn State staff is really good about keeping in-house. So there's just some things that, unfortunately, we're not going to know. And I think that's why we all get so frustrated as Penn State fans of... Okay, something as simple as, like, what is the injury? How is it that Sean Clifford looked like he was going to go down every other play against Illinois, and then 3 days later was announced as 100% for the Ohio State game? And then he looked good. He looked like he was healthy. So it's like, how in the world did that happen? And there's just certain things we're not going to know. I agree, however, on the big win front. It's something that former Penn State quarterback Matt McGloin and myself have talked about on Paydirt, is that outside of the 2016 Big Ten championship game, what have you done for me lately?
The 2016 Ohio State game is... would you count the Fiesta Bowl in 2017 against Washington? Because that was another...
It felt like it was a consolation.
Yeah.
And then, not to say anything negative about that Washington team, but Penn State was favored, and that was Trace and Saquon at the height of their powers. That was an outstanding team that got snubbed. So I agree with you on the point about the Ohio State game victory that year.
But that one was previously, so you're right. That you would say, what have you done for me lately, would be correct, because that is the last time. And 2019, with a new starting quarterback, I think that's an interesting time, because clearly there was a dip after 2017 where Trace was playing football and there weren't the players around him that there were before. Sean Clifford, and I hate to always come back to this, but the last 2 weeks to me have really told me what Sean Clifford is as a quarterback, and this is the finished product. He is a good scrambler that can break down zones against teams that aren't disciplined. He's actually played well in one from the pocket tonight. That was one thing he did not do against Illinois. But if you give him a coverage that he hasn't seen before, and if you hit him and rattle him, that's it. I think he's got a good ceiling as a quarterback that operates in a good environment, but once the environment erodes, he's not going to be a guy that elevates the team to those magical wins. He doesn't have that Trace McSorley vibe about him. So then it becomes playing out this, and then who's the next guy? Like, to me, that is a part of this formula of James Franklin teams and not getting those big wins. They haven't had the better quarterback in a lot of these, and the system is derived, the idea of this style of play is derived off having a good quarterback.
Well, and the mold for James Franklin's quarterbacks has been identical since he was at Vanderbilt. If you look at the guys that were under center, they look and move and play just like Sean Clifford and just like Trace McSorley. And as much as we all love Trace, and Trace is arguably one of the best Penn State quarterbacks ever, you look at the guys that have been the guy at quarterback in college football, and the model that James Franklin rolls with ain't it. So it's just, I don't know. I see a lot of people in the chat, and a lot of people are frustrated with James Franklin overall. I certainly agree that I'm somebody who, from the jump with the guy, was kind of like, okay, I don't know if I'm entirely sold on it, but And then it does make you think, what if Sean comes back for, his extra season of eligibility due to COVID? Now you have Drew Alar, who's on his way. Like, what's going on with Taquan Roberson, Christian Veilleux? What's his potential? There's more questions than answers at that position.
Yeah, and it's not going to get any clearer, I don't think. And by the way, Henry, I didn't see your question. I did see you threw something in the chat, by the way. This was Henry wants to say he had this score for the game and told he was crazy. Henry, I was with you, by the way. I said that this was going to be a closer game than people were expecting. And Vegas was very much leaning into the idea that for the last 6 quarters, Penn State was bad. But, again, it comes back down to the idea that Penn State is built to play this team better than a team that they play once every second or third year from the Big Ten West with a new coaching staff and a wrinkle that they had not prepared for because they had never shown that on film ever. And not to go back to the Illinois game, but I watch the film of all or as many of the games as I can before. Illinois had never come out with that package. And by the way, it didn't work this week. It was a one-off great idea that they had to take advantage of that particular team. And it skewed the perception of Penn State coming into this game. And it skewed the perception of maybe it didn't skew the perception of Illinois, did it? Like, we all knew that was a mirage.
And still, it's a baffling outcome. How did the team that just hung with Ohio State, really did push them to the limit, do what they did against Illinois? I attended that game. I had no idea what I was looking at. That did not look anything like the team that we saw play the first 20 minutes against Iowa, the team that beat Auburn, the team that beat Wisconsin, and looked like it was rolling potentially towards a college football playoff. Like that's the thing, is this continues to be some head-scratching situations. And then for Ohio State, they clearly were underestimating Penn State, but then their fans at the end of the game are audibly chanting, "Not our rivals." Okay, why did you rush the field after beating a team ranked 15 spots lower than you that you were favored to beat by 19 points?
I
by the way, water.
Was this the first time they've done the red out?
The Scarlet out, which is not catchy at all. And gee, I wonder where you came up with that idea.
And also, did you do it against Michigan ever?
I don't know.
By the way, I don't care. I just we're just pointing out truths here that there has not been a Michigan game that's really mattered to Ohio State fans in a while. And this game decides big moments. This game typically decides the Big Ten East. Now, Ohio State can clearly say, we're not ever really worried about you winning this game because you haven't, but we're not worried about it.
It's just hypocritical and just be straight up. I think Ohio State continues to be the standard bearer within the Big Ten. They have been for the last 15 to 20 years, and you sprinkle in Michigan there probably in the last 20 years, especially dating back to the Lloyd Carr era. So it's just Ohio State continues to be at the top there. So, and even with the victory today for Michigan State over Michigan, there's part of me looking at the end of the schedule here for the Big Ten, and I'm like, and then Iowa went down today. I was like, what is the Big Ten title game going to look like? And you can still reasonably say, you know what, Ohio State's probably going to be there, and credit to them, but their fans, yeah. I
want two things. First off, UC Bearcat, somebody who, at least will acknowledge the fact that this is a game that matters to people. I don't think Penn State fans want this to be a rivalry. Well, they do. They probably do. But just acknowledge the fact that the game matters. Let's not pretend like this game doesn't matter. So somebody that is at least willing to do that. And by the way, just to clear something up. So first off, I want to thank everybody for donating to the channel with the super chats. The way it works is, I can see them in a special place, and I have them up here in front of me. And I want to let, who is it over here? Henry, no, we talked about what you brought up. When I see it, we bring it up. And I missed the one because you donated to the channel and then asked your question next. But I did get to your question. So if you do donate to the channel, I will get you the question and anything else that jumps out to me in the chat. I'm not just throwing up James Franklin sucks, we need a new coach. we're not doing that. But if you have something that's interesting to talk about that I can see as I'm rolling through, because we got a lot of people in here tonight. Thanks to everybody watching here on the BWI Live Postgame Show. We're going through questions. We're talking about this game. One of the things, and Henry, here you go, buddy. Here you go. We love you, Henry.
We love you so much.
We love you. There's a lot of stuff going on in the chat, so
really
if I missed
guy.
anything, I apologize.
You're a really smart guy. I bet people like you, and I bet that you're good at your job. And I bet that your family loves you and misses you when you're gone. And I think everything that you got going for you in life is really spectacular. You know what? I love you, and T. Frank really loves you.
Yes, I do. Yes. Now everyone's saying that they're donating and not getting their question answered. Are you guys not paying attention? Because we talked about your stuff. So anyway. One of the things that I think is progression for Penn State football, and again, is this something that Penn State fans care about? 11 of 18 on third down tonight. They were good on third down. They were better than Ohio State. Ohio State was 5 of 14. First off, do you believe that stat? And secondly, do you think it's going to continue?
It's surprising, but honestly, you've come to expect that from this team, this defense at least. I mean, I don't see one offense that's going to get fielded the rest of the year that's better than Ohio State. You're maybe going to see teams that run the ball better. So I find that to be encouraging. Is that an average that you can hang your hat on? It might fluctuate a little bit, yeah, but honestly, that's fantastic. And you kind of have that expectation at this point. And isn't that insane to put the weight of the world on your defense like that? That just doesn't happen very often at the college ranks. And granted, we see what Georgia's doing right now. They haven't given up 14 points to anybody. It's ludicrous. Clearly, they're not. Penn State's not quite there, but this is still the strength of the team. I don't see any reason why they can't do that the rest of the year.
I would. So this is what we were seeing. The 11 of 18 is what we were seeing in the Iowa game. So to me, on the offensive side of things, I think that there's a reality where that does continue. Now, in specific games, Aiden Hutchinson could break Sean Clifford in half, and that would be the end of that. Like, there are singularly great players out there that I think will test Penn State and what they did tonight in situations like that. But this is what we were seeing from Sean Clifford in his development under Mike Yurcich, is that in these, you got to dink and dunk. You got to move the ball through some spot zone coverage down the field. Maybe get something in between the safeties or between the linebackers and safeties. You're not going to get any of these deep posts over the middle with no one around anymore. That part of the offense is gone. But we were seeing that in the Iowa game before he got hurt, and that picked up again tonight in this game. So I do think from a offensive perspective, if they can eke out those 3rd and 2s, which again, against Michigan and Michigan State, maybe you don't do it that way, but I do think that it's possible to continue. And then how many plays did Penn State run tonight? They ran a ton of plays tonight.
I believe it was 52 passes and 29 runs.
Yeah, they held on to the ball. They drove the ball. Let me look at their drive chart. This is always a good indicator. So the fumble to start was bad. Then they had a 13-play drive. Then they had 3 and out. Then they had a 7-play drive. Then they had 2 4-play drives. Then 10. Then 12, and that's to end the half and start the third quarter. Then they had a 4 and out, and then the 11-play drive, and then the interception that sort of ended the game. So, I mean, they had 4 drives of 10-plus plays. Is that good or bad to you, that they can't hit the explosive play to punch it in for a touchdown after 6 plays? Like, not to put a number on it, but that they have to continue to work and work and work and work to get down the field.
It just kind of seems like that is, unfortunately, the MO of the offense, and we only really saw the explosive plays, in September. It's been a minute. It does seem like those dried up, whether that's these defenses just being prepared for what's on tape, but we really haven't seen that consistently in a minute. So, unfortunately, this might just be the way the offense is built, and especially with the running game being anemic. I appreciated the effort to start the game, like really consistently running the ball, but also part of me was, cringing a little bit that it's like, okay, so we're just going to start by falling on our faces to get going here. So it's just, I don't know.
From Noah Cain, no less, right? From Noah Cain.
Yeah, Noah continues to, it's just not been his year, but John Lovett continues to show you some good glimmers. I was curious what you thought about the goal line formation that they used for the Kevon Lee touchdown.
They've used it a couple times this year, and it's been effective. I like that because the way they have it set up is, and I think I have this right, where you have Brenton Strange in the middle, and then you got running backs on either side. So it's a balanced formation. You can go either way, and both guys typically are big guys. Either it's Noah Kane or Kevon Lee. So you have realistically a good blocking formation going either way. The problem was before which game was it? I think it was the Indiana game. Nobody got a block. Like both the big guys did not block their player, and then Kevon Lee stood up at the goal line. So I think it's a good formation. I think that their wrinkles down there are good, even all the way down to Jahan Dotson getting the snap in the Tyler Warren Wildcat. I didn't see that one coming. Like I figured that he was going to throw out of that. That would be the wrinkle. But having again a lead blocker, and then I think it was Theo Johnson out front or Strange out front, where you've got two big guys blocking, and they did a better job blocking in space. They're still not doing great on the interior blocking or blocking in line, but they did a much better job blocking in space against Ohio State. And by the way, one of the things I did notice about the running game, to bring that part up, Ohio State was run blitzing the entire third quarter.
Yes.
So they didn't care what the play was. They were attacking the line of scrimmage. And if they got pressure, great. If they got a tackle for loss, great. But they were not allowing anything to happen at the line of scrimmage. So as much as it is you want to have it happen anyway, if a team is determined to stop you from doing that, that's something that this offense has not been able to counter. So that's not a big surprise that once they kind of decided that was over, it was over. Yeah. Oh, and Henry's going to make a $20,000 donation. I think he's messing with me now.
$20,000. Oh, is that supposed to be what Franklin makes a day or something?
I don't know. He's just mad that we haven't talked about his Vegas pick, even though we stopped the show to talk about his stuff. So if you want to give us a super chat, great. If you're gonna like guilt us into talking about your thing, even though we did,
we love Henry.
We love Henry. Yeah. We love Henry, but I will not be held hostage. So what else from this game or have you been thinking about we haven't touched on yet? Is there anything else you're thinking about that going forward in the final couple minutes we're here on the BWI Live Postgame Show?
It's a very odd season, isn't it? In that, I remember in August, and you and I were speaking quite a bit at that point, just in terms of like, what could this team really amount to be? And I said on my own podcast, I'm like, I think this could be an 8-4 team. Mm-hmm. And I still believe that. But even after this game, I'm like, okay, you see what they can be, what their ultimate potential can be if a couple things bounce their way, turnovers go away, etc. And then the Illinois game is still just like stuck in the back of your mind, just like, how in the world did that happen? I guess my question to you is, offensively, do you just accept that the running game does not work? And you up that percentage in the passing game from like 64% to like 75% of the game?
Yeah. If it were Patrick Mahomes, I'd be all on board. If it were Josh Allen, I'd be all on board. It's Sean Clifford though. That's the problem because it is working. I mean, they are competitive. They are in these games, but ultimately they've fallen short. And that is the unfortunate thing. Got a couple more questions here. This one is the most pressing of the night. Tom, what is your secret to being an international sex symbol? I've wondered that my entire life that I've known you, but I think it's the shape of his head. He's got a great shaped head.
This is the funniest question ever. International, I think the only reason is because I worked for WWE for close to 9 years and was fortunate to be on live global television screaming at the top of my lungs. So the other part, if that's your assessment, that's very nice of you, Peter. So we now love Henry and we love Peter. Thank you very much.
And you got great hair, Tom. You have
I have gray hair. And luckily this fabulous backdrop to make you all feel, I don't know. You assume whatever you want to assume. That's your prerogative.
So debonair in your manner back there. Baby. Brick fireplace.
I'm seeing a lot of questions, and I know you and I have talked about this before. Drew Allar.
Yeah.
Is the hype real?
So a month ago, I would have said no because there's things he needs to work on. But the more I've watched him, the more he's worked on it. And I would credit, James Franklin talked about him as legally as he was allowed to because he can't comment on a player. But somebody asked him about a vague player and how he's become so good. So everything they talked about Sean Clifford tonight, where when he was off, it was because he wasn't stepping into his throws. The front foot of your quarterback is probably the most important part of your entire offense. If he is accurate and delivers the ball on time in rhythm, and he plants his foot in the direction of the player he's throwing the ball to, he will be generally accurate as long as everything else on his body works. His arm and everything's tied together. Mm-hmm. Drew Allar had a problem with that early in his, I'd say last year specifically, and then this year he was working on it, but it was pretty ugly. So there was a lot of overthrows, underthrows, missed throws. So those have cleaned up. He has been much more accurate down the stretch. And I haven't done a deep dive on everything, but he is becoming that guy. And it doesn't always have to be. So that's the thing, right? There was a little bit of Christian Hackenberg there for me for a little bit, but he is much more than that. And from a cerebral standpoint, he's operating an offense where it's 5 wide between the 20s. So everything's on him. He's reading the coverage. He's delivering the ball. He's having to make pre-snap decisions. So that's all good. To David's question, and then we got to get to Henry because he's
being very generous.
He's being very generous, and he's being very frustrated. So, David, I think this is interesting because Penn State's young guys able to compete with Ohio State's guys. This is the part that's, I think, disappointing about how this team is constructed is because the strength of the team and the way you win big games is you have good coverage. Brisker's gone. After tonight, Joey Porter Jr. can go and be a first-round pick in the draft, like first or second. Like he's phenomenally talented. That was the game I was expecting of him this year after watching the way he played against Olave and Wilson last year, where he was everything was almost. And this year, he was there. So if you lose those guys, and then Ebikete's gone, Tangelo's gone, maybe Mustafa's gone, depending on his draft stock and whether he wants to come back or not. So on the defensive side of the ball, they're all gone. Dotson is gone. You've got a new quarterback. Then you've got the young guys, Washington, Keandre Lambert-Smith, the tight ends. But the offensive line, what's the situation there going forward? I think the moral victory is that they weren't blown out and embarrassed on national television, which everyone was expecting, and that this team, especially the offense and the defensive coordinators, are smart. So like they have good plans, and despite what people are angry about, they have a good plan in most games. So I got to get to Henry. We'll bring this up again because Henry is it wants us to acknowledge the fact that he had Penn State winning 28-27, and he was told he was high. So he wants you to know that he was right. I understand that feeling, by the way, Henry, because I've been saying that all day.
Yeah, I said it when we started off this postgame show, is that the spread was 19, the over-under was 61. I felt both of those to be odd, in that part of me was always thinking about the under. I thought it was going to be a lot more of a difference than it actually was, with the final score being 33-24. So I was like, oh, okay, they got pretty close to it. But the spread always felt odd to me. It just, It was strength on strength in terms of you have the number one offense. I think Ohio State came in 5th in scoring, 49 points, and then Penn State was 6th in points allowed and 14 points per game. And I was like, okay, they're going to meet in the middle somewhere with that. So that doesn't necessarily bode for Penn State getting blown out. I appreciate the optimism. I think that was something that a lot of people needed. And again, it just keeps coming back to this team is just inconsistent. There's tons of potential. It's just chaining this all together.
Yeah.
And more competitive today than even in 2016, 2017. Yeah, it's tough for me to agree with that because those Saquon Barkley, Trace McSorley teams were just above and beyond, man. Those teams were great. And I understand the frustration of people is that, yes, Franklin had begun to put his fingerprints on that team, but had not completely. So there's now looking at this team and saying, oh, if that's comparable, it's like, yeah, but still wildly inconsistent. That's the issue.
So the 2016-2017 team, to me, when you look at the way Joe Moorhead called the game, it was different than what Mike Yurcich is. And Mike Yurcich and what Sean Clifford is doing right now is Sean Clifford's playing quarterback. Like he's playing, like he's doing things at an NFL style. Not an NFL level, obviously, but he's having to do things at that level and operate from the pocket and play the position the way I think we're all familiar with. Joe Moorhead's system made it feel so different, and it made it feel frustrating at times, especially, don't forget, that team couldn't run the ball either. They also had a bad offensive line. They just had Saquon Barkley. If this team has Saquon Barkley, it's a very different story. And that's, I think, the disappointing thing about the Sean Clifford situation and everything with his tenure at Penn State is the last 2 years have been so disjointed from the injuries of the running back. And there's fewer excuses this year. But like last year, not having Journey Brown, having everything kind of cave in around him. And this year, everything's put on his shoulders, and he doesn't have any supporting cast from the running game. Yeah. So he could have been the quarterback to elevate Penn State if the team was better. But ifs and ands, buts and words, it isn't to be. So then you got to kind of look to the future, and that's where I guess the rest of this season is be respectable and then recover for your hopes of being contending with the big-time teams next year.
Yeah, man, I know you touched on it, this a little off track, but what Journey Brown could have been, goodness. My heart went out for him when he had to step away for medical reasons. Man, he was onto something special, just a really good kid, too. Just that was one of the more difficult stories in the last 5 years of Penn State football. That was tough.
Here's a question and I want to end here pretty soon, but this is one of those situations where everyone that is a Penn State fan is angry after losing those 2 games, because then if you lose this game, then you've lost 3, but if you only lost this one, then you'd still be in the national championship contention. Is it time for Penn State to drop that expectation and be something different?
Is that a question for the university or the fan base? I don't think the university is going to start saying, hey, it's all right if we do 8-4 to 10-2. Now, I understand you haven't seen a national championship since the 80s. And listen, I wasn't even alive then, so I'm hoping to see a national title before I die. That would be great. I'm glad that my mother, who is a graduate, got to see a pair of national titles. So it's just very frustrating. I understand where Penn State fans are at, and it is extraordinarily difficult to get over the hump, because I see all these people in the chat and that they maybe want James Franklin to leave. So I dare to ask you, who is the replacement? Who is the next person out there that can really put this all together? Because of all the coaches in college football that can absolutely get the job done, it's Nick Saban. Ryan Day at least appears to be positioned well at Ohio State to continue what Urban Meyer and Jim Tressel have built. Yep. Lincoln Riley, you feel positive at least about what he's able to cultivate out of his quarterbacks, and he recruits extraordinarily well. Kirby Smart hasn't really proven that he can get over the hump to a national title.
He's on top of the hump right now.
He's looking good right now, but Georgia has a tendency to slip in November. So it's just a question of, can they finish? So my point being is that, let's say James Franklin is no longer with Penn State under whatever means next season. Who's the next guy? Who's the guy that's better than James Franklin? You'd be hard pressed, I think, to find somebody that is better as a recruiter and better as a coach overall. I see a lot of people in there saying, just go sign Joe Moorhead, go get Bill O'Brien from Alabama, and call Larry Johnson Sr. And there's plenty of those ideas out there, and you just never know how these scenarios are actually going to happen in a boardroom. That's fine. Part of me is like, all right, you got to be grateful with what you have right now, but in no way, shape, or form should the athletic department, the university, or the fan base be sitting there and being like, we're good with 8-4 to 10-2. That's nice. We're filling the stadium. We're making boatloads of cash. I get that. No, this fan base demands a national title.
Yeah. And so there's a couple of different moving parts with this particular conversation. And it's something that one of my colleagues, Nate Bauer, has done a lot of great work on. We've talked about on the BWI Daily Edition of there right now is a disconnect between what the fans want and what the fans expect, what James Franklin wants to deliver and what he wants from the university and what the university is currently willing to do in order to be competitive. And that right now is a part of the story. And fans don't want to hear that. They want to look at what happens on the film. And they want to watch their TV and say, that guy sucks. And they want to say, that's the reason we're not losing, that we're not winning, that these big games, and people in the chat are talking about, like, Ohio State has unbelievably talented players every single year. Well, how do you think they get those players? It's not just by winning a couple of games 10 years ago and then just keeping the ball rolling. They are far and ahead of everyone else in the Big Ten in facilities, in structure, in commitment to winning at football. And that is the part, and James Franklin has talked about this for 5 years now. He's talked about it vaguely. He's talked about it openly. He's talked about it in a bunch of different ways of you can't lose ground in any facet of your program, or else you're going to be left in the dust. And right now, Penn State is competitive with these teams. And yes, they lost to Illinois as an ugly loss. That was probably the worst loss of James Franklin's tenure since 2016, I'd say. Mm-hmm. And that happened this year. There's no way around that. But the reality of the situation is, if the university is not interested in doing that, that to me is the reason he's leaving. Not because he wants more money. And if you want him fired, if you want him to move on, then you want to hope that Penn State is fine with 8-4, because that's the situation that's going to dictate change. So let's end on something else. Let's end on literally anything else other than talk about that.
Apparently, my international sex symbol status has been revoked because I had anything positive to say about James Franklin. Man, I didn't realize how delicate that status could come and go. That's a shame.
Oh man.
Yeah. You know what I am encouraged about is, next week Maryland feels like a winnable game, especially what you put out there this week. Hopefully every last one of these guys heads back to State College and it's like, hey, you know what? That was positive. Do that again and you'll beat Maryland. And you will probably beat a team like Michigan if you duplicate that performance. But that's a big if. And again, I'm worried about the inconsistency. And I know it's a struggle. We've talked to people in the chat here have talked about moral victories. This is the poster boy for a moral victory. Yep. And there is a lot of positive to take away from it. Now it's just up to them. What are you going to do with it?
Yep. Penn State pushes Ohio State to the limit. They lose 33-24 in a game that was, I hate saying things like this, closer than it appeared, but Ohio State with a late field goal gets it to 33. Penn State unable to rally and match in the final 5 minutes with an interception by Sean Clifford. This is the BWI Live Postgame Show. Tom Hannifan with me. He's the co-host of the Paydirt Podcast. When can we hear you next on Paydirt?
We have a new episode coming out Monday morning. We'll be breaking down this entire game. Myself and former Penn State quarterback Matt McGloin. We do new episodes every Monday and every Friday, reacting and previewing to all Penn State games.
Do this again next week? What do you think?
I would love to. I think we got to find out when kickoff is. But yeah.
All right. We'll be back after the next game here on the BWI Live Postgame Show. The BWI Daily Edition comes to you Monday morning, and our live Monday recap show at noon on Mondays. I'm your host, Thomas Frank Carr. We'll talk to you then.